Assalamu alaikum and welcome everyone to our end of legislative session live stream. I am your co-host, Adam Soltani, along with my esteemed co-host, Nicole Bauman, and we are very excited to have you join us today as we talk about what has gone on in legislative session in Oklahoma this year from February up until just a few weeks ago. And there's a lot to cover, and we have a very limited amount of time to do so. So before we get started, I want to go ahead and turn it over to Nicole Bauman, our esteemed advocacy coordinator for CAIR Oklahoma. She's going to briefly introduce herself and then introduce our guest. Nicole?
Hi, everyone. My name is Nicole Bauman. I'm the advocacy coordinator with CAIR Oklahoma. So I was lucky to work with several of these people on the call with us, tracking legislation, meeting with legislators, watching out for the good and bad and everything else this session. So we'll just go around. Andy, if you want to start and introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Andy Moore. I'm the CEO of Let's Fix This. We're a nonprofit that focuses on civic engagement, just generally pro-democracy measures. Really excited to be here.
So I'll have Cindy, if you want to go ahead.
Thanks, Nicole. Hey, y'all. My name is Cindy Nguyen. Pronouns are she, hers, and I am the policy director for the ACLU of Oklahoma. And I will pass it to Taz.
Hey, everybody. My name is Tasneem Michael. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Pronouns he, him, his. I'm the Central Regional Organizer with Together Oklahoma, our advocacy wing of the Oklahoma Policy Institute.
Hi, I'm Ellen Pogamiller with the Oklahoma Education Association, and I serve as one of our organizers and lobbyists.
Wonderful. And Veronica, would you like to introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure. Thanks so much, everybody who's joining us on the live stream. And to our audience, I serve as the Deputy Director here at CAIR Oklahoma. And today I'll be taking a backseat, just running things behind the scenes. So if anyone has questions who's watching, please drop those in the comments. I will see them, and I will make sure that our esteemed group of contributors today are able to answer all of the questions that you might have. Thanks, everyone, for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're here not just to give updates on what happened this legislative session, but also to take any questions from folks who are watching us. We are live on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. You can find us at CAIR_Oklahoma or at CAIR Oklahoma. And we would love to see what you have to say and what questions you may have. So I think we're going to get started with some updates from the realm of education from Ellen. And we look forward to hearing what has been going on when it comes to education and the legislative session this year. I know this has been a spillover from even last year when there was a lot going on regarding critical race theory and the banning of that, so to say, and what impact that had on education. And now there's a lot going on when it comes to religious charter schools, vouchers, and so on. So, Ellen, please give us what updates you have from education.
Oh man, you made a wide array of things that I could discuss for you all. So I may just start with just an overview of this session. I know the public education really took up a lot of room at the Capitol. I mean, it really stopped a lot of other efforts in both good and bad ways, I would say, because so much of the energy of session was looking at two things. One, how do we fund public education? And also how, for a group of people, how do we get expanded school choice in order to appease both entities in our state? So for the win from public educators, we can talk that we got a $678 million investment. And when you look at that over the course of 6 years, that is double more invested in school public education than we have ever had. And it will allow teacher pay raise between $3,000 and $6,000. It will allow discretionary spending for our schools so that we could potentially pay support staff more, or if there are programs that maybe have gone away or that districts want to enhance, we have that opportunity for schools to make local choices about that, which was really important for us. We have Redbud funding, which would benefits a majority of the schools, both rural, some urban, and then all of our charter schools will see a funding increase with that funding. We got maternity leave. That was a big win for both educators, and actually our state employees received maternity leave this year. It's just maternity. We get a lot of questions, and it's just right after your baby is born. It's not something that you can expand. And, if you have a baby July 1st, that's when your 6 weeks start. So maybe you get 2 weeks at the beginning of the school year. But at least that was a conversation that we had in the room, and we were able to kind of push an agenda to allow our women to have that opportunity. We're going to do a literacy pilot program to try to enhance literacy across the state by providing more training to our school districts. And then we have a safety pilot program for safety in schools. So they've received $50 million over 3 years. So that was kind of some big wins. The other side of the story is that within that, there was a push for a tax credit, which would allow anybody who sends their children to private school, no matter their income, there was no income cap on this, for them to receive between $5,000 and $7,500. It's a cap, it's a scale based on your income level. The challenge with that is that while it's a tax credit, so it's not directly taking funds from education, it does take from the overall budget. So there's so many, all of the callers or all of the presenters have issues that are beyond education that we also believe in, that it can't just be funding education. It has to be funding healthcare and mental health in our state. And so tax credits do take away from the overall budget. On top of that, we know that the majority of people that use tax credit vouchers like these are people that are already attending private school. And we also know from history of other states who have enacted vouchers that a majority of these private schools end up raising their tuition. So it doesn't become a break for private school families. It becomes an investment of our tax dollars going to private schools. So I can start there, but then I know you had other questions I'm happy to answer too.
Yeah, sure. Let's stay on this voucher issue for just a minute, because one of the conversations that we've seen going around is, will this bring? So I know, you said it's going to raise tuitions. It's not really going to be like a huge benefit for the parents sending their kids to private schools. I guess the question is there any silver lining in that? Would this be a benefit for the private schools themselves in terms of having better funding or not? Because, we know this has happened. That's, I guess, the question that's on everyone's mind. And the reason I bring this up is because the Islamic schools, we have two in Oklahoma, K through 12 private schools, they struggle with funding as nonprofits, and they're slowly building up their endowments and their ability to have better funding foundation. So I guess that's the question, is there any benefit for private schools, or is this just something that takes away from everyone at the end of the day?
Well, I do, if you are someone who can utilize these programs and maybe it allows you to expand some people who had not been able to enter your doors before because of the funding was an issue, they didn't have that type of money, I would say so. I think the challenge from a taxpayer's perspective is that even if it's a benefit to those groups, it can't come with the same amount of accountability as, when I send my kids to public school. So I do think there's a funding mechanism that we will now be sending to private schools, but there's an accountability level that we all should be concerned about, that we're ensuring that those dollars are really doing what they said they were going to do. And I'm not sure we have if we're able to confirm that there's an accountability measure there.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And I know that was a challenging question to ask, but, I think that's a conversation that's been going around. And of course, as an organization, we believe in the great importance of funding public schools and public education. And we need to invest more over there in the public school infrastructure. So we definitely want to see, us head in that direction. Nicole, what other questions did you have for Ellen?
I think we do have a question in the comments, so if you want to go to that one first. We have a question. It says, how do vouchers impact teacher and tutors' compensation, if at all?
So the way the voucher that was set up in this capacity, it's only can be used in two ways. It can be used as private school tuition. And so you do have to show as a parent or guardian, whoever is paying for that to receive the tax credit, you do have to show I'm attending X private school and submit that to the state tax agency to show that. There's also a homeschool component, which I did not mention, and that is a $1,000 tax credit that maybe you could use for tutoring. But there's not a way that it directly impacts teachers and tutors' compensation other than that. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. While we're talking about, schooling and public schools, what is your take on what happened last session and how that's impacted public education as far as, this whole wave of across the nation, really, of trying to ban critical race theory? Because I actually had a meeting with my senator this session and I brought it to his attention, and his, feedback was, well, I haven't seen any direct negative impact. But as a parent, I feel like even if that doesn't directly impact the classroom, work or the discussions, there's still this message being sent to teachers that you have to be cautious. Almost you better walk on eggshells and be careful what you say because it could be used against you. But I would like to hear your perspective on that.
So we are always supportive of honesty in education. It's always been a focus for us at OEA and for educators to have that freedom to have honest conversations and to answer honestly when students are asking questions. What we can say is that over the past year and a half, we have had 2 incidences, I would use quotes, but of critical race theory in the classroom. We have not seen it at all. And so it becomes this challenge that we continue to talk in this big scheme of like, we are seeing, X, Y, and Z, and we have a process for it actually to go up to the State Department of Ed. And month after month at our State Department of Ed meetings, there is no evidence this is happening. But to your point, the unintended consequences of this type of messaging, I do think put some concern and fear into educators' minds, whether it should be or not, in a way that I think is negatively impacts classroom discussions.
Yeah. Nicole, what other questions do you have for Ellen?
And I will say for everyone, we've invited sort of subject matter experts in different categories, but for other members on the call, feel free to hop in if you have feedback. I know we have parents on the call. We have a lot of different perspectives, so don't feel like you can't speak on something just because it's not quite your specialty. I would say one of the questions I have is if you can just tell us more about what you do and kind of what your specific advocacy is that you do at the Capitol.
So my role as the way Oklahoma Education Association work is we are a membership-led organization. So in order for me to even have this job, we have members who, pay dues on their own accord and create priority focuses for our association. So, obviously teacher pay, support pay, community schools, better programming for our students. All of those are at the forefront of our organization. And so my role, 1 is a lobbyist, but 2 is to make sure our members are engaged in the work. They're educated on what's happening at the Capitol and they want to feel included. And so I know everyone on this call can talk about like, oh, I would love to go to the Capitol, but I'm nervous. And every single time we talk to our members, it's like, they don't want to hear from me at the Capitol. They want to hear from you. You are their constituents and they care about what you care about. And so part of our role is just trying to get our members to the Capitol or have members invite their legislators to their classroom to start conversations about what's happening in public schools and how they can be a part of positive change.
Yeah.
Nice. Is there anything maybe for future sessions or an in-between time that your organization is looking forward to?
Well, we want education to be on the forefront of people's minds, but in a positive way, because we think there are incredible things happening in our public schools. And so, I think a big focus for us moving forward is how do we retain our staff? And what does that look like? What is hindering people from staying in education? Because ultimately, I think we can all say, name the teachers that changed our lives. And if we are not making sure that those teachers stay in the classroom, and if we're not having strong exit interviews for those teachers who are leaving, we're going to be at a disservice next session if we just are talking about money, which is important, but there's so many other components that are really making teachers reconsider the profession. So I think our hope next session is that we're continuing to expand beyond what our schools need and what that looks like.
I do have one other question for you, Ellen. And of course, if any of our other guests, have questions, please jump in. And we have put across the bottom of the screen the website for OEA. So please, for our viewers, go check that out and see how you can be more involved. One of the things that we've seen consistently over the years as an organization is that there is a lack of quality education, factual education about the Islamic faith and about people who originate from the Middle East and North Africa and places like, Pakistan, Indonesia, Muslim majority countries. And a lot of that has to do with that the textbooks do not cover it correctly. Or I recall years ago, there was a particular small school district in Oklahoma that wanted to remove those parts from the textbook or didn't want to use textbooks. So the question I have for you is, and I think a lot of Muslim parents have this on their mind, how can we eventually see better pluralistic, multicultural education in the classroom, whether or not the textbooks and the curriculums support that?
I think that is an excellent question. And obviously, that is where people who are experts in that and who know that are going to have to help our education community that may not have leadership that represents those, the entities that you were talking about. And I would really encourage, what's so important is we so often focus on state Department of Ed or our state legislature, and we can do so much more changes through our local school district. And really, they oversee the curriculum at the local school level. Okay. And they also, most school districts, especially large school districts, have like a textbook committee or a curriculum committee. And I would really encourage your viewers to reach out to those committee heads to really talk to them about, hey, here's some things that you all are missing, or honestly may not be getting right. And that's okay, to tell people that, but we're not going to be better unless we know more. And sometimes it does. And sometimes I hate to tell groups, you got to take the extra step, because that's really shouldn't be on you all. But if you see districts that are not doing that, I think it's a real opportunity to educate those, and starting really at the direct local level with the curriculum leaders or, team leader, like social studies or whatever the content that you think should reflect that should be.
Wonderful suggestion. So, an encouragement for our viewers, for parents to get involved, to talk to not just teachers, but also to, as you mentioned, textbook committees and the local school districts. That's wonderful. All right. Any last questions for Ellen, or any of our other guests would like to chime in with anything? Okay. Ellen, thank you so much. Of course, if you need to leave at any point, feel free to hop out. But we've so enjoyed hearing from you and getting some solid education on what's going on and how we can be involved. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I have to pick up my kids from camp, but I'm going to stay on as long as I can until I have to drive to get them.
All right, wonderful. I think next we're going to turn to Cindy from the ACLU of Oklahoma. Nicole, what questions do we have to start out with Cindy?
All right. So we know the ACLU tracks a lot of things, but we didn't want to leave you on the phone all day on a Friday. So we know it's been a very busy year in a variety of topics for you all. In particular, could you highlight some of maybe the good or bad that happened in the area of criminal justice reform?
Thanks, Nicole. Yes, I am more than happy to do so. Yes, the ACLU of Oklahoma tracks a lot of bills, including criminal legal reform bills. So out of about 60 bad criminal legal reform bills, we were monitoring about 10 of those bills passed. So at the ACLU, we hold true to our commitment that we do not want to see new fines or new crimes. Yet, unfortunately, we keep seeing these at the legislature. And I think it may surprise some people, but we can't exactly punish our way into a better Oklahoma. And yet we keep seeing rollbacks on State Question 780. So for those who may not be familiar with what State Question 780 was, is that it reclassified simple drug possession and some property crimes down from a felony down to a misdemeanor. So because of a lot of these things, every single year since it has passed, we keep seeing the legislature trying to roll back on the will of the voters. So we saw House Bill 2153, which was a State Question 780 rollback. It established new mandatory minimums for every fourth time drug possession. This does not include marijuana, but we were extremely disappointed to see that this bill, that this type of bill passed, as well as many other bills. We saw bills that would have lowered the grand larceny limit, meaning that if you had stolen something that was about $750, you are now facing a felony instead of stealing something that was $1,000 and facing a felony for that. We also saw bills that increase scores in public schools. So we know that this can contribute to the school to prison pipeline. It can contribute to racial as well as religious profiling for many students. And we were very concerned about that because it passed bipartisan measures. So I see the role of our affiliate is really making sure that we are holding each side of the aisle accountable for the votes that they make. However, there were a couple good bills that did pass and that we did defeat with other coalition members. So if you remember, House Bill 1976 was the Oklahoma version of the Patriot Act. It was a completely awful bill that would have given the Department of Public Safety unchecked power to investigate anybody in our state. And if you don't remember, the Commissioner of Public Safety is also assigned by our governor himself. So that would have opened up a lot of things. It would have opened up Pandora's box and made things a lot worse for a lot of marginalized community members that are already over-policed. We also saw House Bill 2161. This would have forced citizen review boards investigating law enforcement to include at least 2/3 of those members on the board to be part of law enforcement. So thankfully, we were able to defeat all of those bills. And we also see really good bills as well. So I counted about 4 to 5 really good criminal legal reforms and ways to make progress in our state that did pass the legislative session. So one of the biggest ones was funding State Question 781. So State Question 781 was part of State Question 780 in that it would have taken all of the money from incarceration and move it to save from decarceration and move it into mental health funding for our state. So Senate Bill 844 helped pass that. I think it only took about 6 to 7 years after the passage of State Question 781. We also saw House Bill 2259. This is probably one of our proudest moments in that it allows court fines and fees to establish a process to waive those type of fees. So it allows judges to waive court fines and fees if people are unable to pay. We also see House Bill 2042, and allows police officers to use a verbal warning for outstanding warrants instead of automatically arresting people on the spot. And then lastly, we see House Bill 2210. This is one of my favorite bills in that it provides relief for child sexual abuse survivors sentenced as adults. We see oftentimes people who have faced sexual abuse committing crimes to survive a lot of the things that they have been through. And this will allow judges to go outside of the mandatory minimums and make sure that they look at each case individually.
And I do think there's one, not quite in the criminal justice reform realm, but another cause for celebration with a lot of the work of the ACLU for Senate Bill 429. Would you be able to kind of talk about that and share a little bit of that success story for everyone?
Yes, of course. So Senate Bill 429 was our Tribal Regalia Graduation Protection Bill. That is a mouthful. This has been my heart and soul at the very beginning of session. I think it took about 3 years to finally pass. We were able to meet with both authors and ask if we could take a different approach instead of just centering religious freedom and having tribal regalia at the very bottom of the bill. We asked them what would happen if we unapologetically fought for not only tribal sovereignty, but making sure that students had the right to wear the regalia at graduation. So we saw it pass unanimously on both sides, except for one vote in the House. And yet the governor continued to veto this bill, meaning towards the very end of session, we were rushing around to make sure that we had the votes to pass it not only once, but twice. So the legislature did pass Senate Bill 429, meaning that Indigenous students are allowed to wear the regalia, including beaded caps, eagle feathers, plumes, stoles, because ever since the governor's veto, we had about 6 Indigenous students be denied the right to wear the regalia just because of his veto empowering school districts to say that students cannot wear it. So we are extremely proud of this bill, and it's the website.
Always good news when there's something to celebrate from the Capitol. We might switch here just for a second. You were also, and probably Ellen as well, looking at some of the library censorship attempts. There are several bills looking to restrict what can be kind of looked at a library, and then also restricting what's taught in classrooms, as we've seen before. How do you feel that this affects particularly marginalized and minority communities in Oklahoma?
Yeah, that's a great question. We always believe that young people deserve access to a complete and accurate history of Oklahoma as well as the country that they grew up in. And because there are so many bills that not only that don't even pass, but do pass, creating even more censorship for teachers. And we had a school district last session try to tell teachers to remove about 44 books in their classroom because of a bill that didn't even pass. So because of these things, we continue to see library boards take language from bills that did not pass the legislature and try to implement it in the library, telling people that any books that have to do with gender identity, sexuality, race, or any type of books that make people uncomfortable have to be removed or remove their programs and displays because of these programs. So there were about 30 censorship bills introduced this session. Fortunately, only one of those classroom bills passed. So we saw House Bill 1397, which we call a whitewashing of history, meaning that the state superintendent was given the power to create a civil rights curriculum focused on only nonviolent tactics used by Dr. MLK Jr., which I don't know about you, but the civil rights movement is beyond and involves many tactics, not only nonviolent. However, we also saw attacks on public libraries as well as school libraries. So Senate Bill 397, which fortunately did not pass, was a library rating system. This would have required public school libraries as well as just school libraries in general to rate their books and move books deemed for juniors and seniors away from the other books. And it would have required students to get a permission slip just to get access to any type of books deemed for juniors and seniors. It would have also required any type of books that are excessively, quote, sexual in nature or appealing to the prurient interest to be removed completely. However, we ask who gets to determine what type of books gets removed? Do we really want to put that type of power into the hands of politicians who don't even know the name of our children or know what their favorite color is or what type of books they like to read? So we saw some really bad bills, about 30 of them, but fortunately only one of them passed when it came to censorship.
Yeah, Cindy, you brought up a good point, and would love to hear Ellen what your thoughts are on this, because I think that is one of the big challenges, is that we have politicians, people who are not experienced in education, with the exception of a few, who are trying to make these decisions for educators. And I think about one book that I use in the classroom at the university level in my adjunct teaching, which is the autobiography of Malcolm X. And how important and how much of a positive impact that book brings to my students. I'll never forget, I had a young African American woman in my course, and at the end of reading the autobiography of Malcolm X, I asked, how has this changed your perspective on American history? And her hand shot up right away, and I said, yes. What are your thoughts? And she said, before I took this course and before I read this book, my understanding was Malcolm X was an angry black man. But now I know that his life and his history is so complex, and he's contributed so much to the betterment, not only of the African American community, but America as a whole. And therefore, I think it's important that kids, youth, young people be able to access these things. But simultaneously, I also understand that we have to be cognizant of age appropriate materials, right? Like the autobiography of Malcolm X wouldn't be appropriate for my son who's going into 5th grade to read, but I think it would be very appropriate for high school students to read and discuss. So, Ellen, what are your thoughts on, the censorship of books, materials that should be used, and how do we respond to what's going on when it comes to censorship right now?
I mean, who doesn't love a librarian? I mean, they're literally some of my favorite people. And especially school librarians. When I talk to legislators, I'm like, I guarantee the school librarian you're thinking in your head is not the school librarian that we have in our schools right now. And before we start creating, laws and bills, can you have reached out to your school librarian to talk about the work that goes into curating your local school's library? And that's really where we tried to move that conversation with all of the legislation around libraries, is to make it a local school decision. There's already like rules in place right now that if you want to challenge a book or want to look at a book, you go through your local school district. Taking this to the state level is, one, ineffective, but two, it really does devalue the diversity that we have in our local school districts. And our books and our libraries should reflect that diversity and hold those values true. And we have that already. And so I was very thankful when House Bill 397 failed. But one interesting thing about it is, at one point in its history, all this session, it actually changed into a super positive library bill that actually empowered librarians and actually kind of put libraries at the Department of Library Services instead of under the Department of Ed, in hopes of really keeping professionals overseeing how our libraries work. And so that to me is, those conversations should happen at the local level. And I think the majority of people really respect and want accurate education and value diversity through libraries in our schools.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the record probably needs to be set straight, especially for some of our elected officials that like to get on, social media and say all these erroneous things about what's going on in public schools. But public schools are not teaching white students to be guilty about the history of slavery in America, as an example. And there are many other things we could touch upon, but I think people need to understand that this is just political rhetoric. And what's going on in schools and what should be going on in schools is teaching young people about the actual history of not only their country, but their world, not for people to feel guilty, but as Kareem Abdul-Jabbar says in his book, Writings on the Wall, that you cannot build a better future unless you know about your past. And history is a, is a blueprint for how we build a better future. And so I think that's something that people need to understand, and that teachers are doing their absolute best to educate, but they're also being challenged every day with these new laws that are coming into place. And we don't want to create an atmosphere where teachers just freeze up and feel like they have to stick to this very rigid curriculum. Is that what a statement you would agree with, Ellen?
Yes, absolutely. I remember talking to actually a school counselor one time who he said to me, do you not think that our community, when our kids walk in our classroom, that they bring their community with them? Why would I not talk about these issues? And absolutely, we can't censor, how people feel, but we can have hard conversations, and they're going to have them at home. They're going to have them in the classroom, but we want kids to wrestle with what happens in today, but also what wrestled with what happened before us and what that means today.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And before we go back to Cindy to kind of wrap up what's going on with the ACLU, I will share a quick story from when I was in 6th grade. At this time, 6th grade was still part of elementary school in Manhattan, Kansas. And my teacher, Mr. Clark, still remember him to this day. And, it's been a while, but we were in touch a few years ago, and that was great to reconnect. I remember him telling us a story about a racist incident of racism he faced when he was growing up in Tennessee, and about how he was treated by, his family was mistreated, if you will, by white police officers, and how that really made him feel, and the impact that had on his life and his educational experience. And that was a moment, for me as a young person, that had a lot of impact, especially being somebody who came from a multicultural, multi-faith home, that I could see that there are other people like me who are going through struggles, but yet they become educators, right? They become somebody who can bring a positive impact to society. And I can't imagine where my life would have been without hearing that story, as well as the many other experiences that Mr. Clark led us through when we were in 6th grade. So good luck, Ellen, OEA, and to all our educators out there, because, you've got a difficult and challenging task ahead of you, but we support you in every way possible. Cindy, to go back to you, can you kind of just tell us if there anything else that ACLU is looking at as we're moving into interim studies and legislative session next year? And how can people get involved with the ACLU? I think it's a name that people are familiar with, but may not know how they can get more involved with the organization.
Yeah, so one of the most disappointing things that we saw this legislative session is that they did not pass the criminalized survivors bill, which we may see another interim study on. Last year we saw an interim study on many survivors of domestic violence who fought back against their abusers and ending up in prison because of that. So we thought it was going to be a popular bill, but we knew that it was going to be an uphill battle with many prosecutors as well. So we are expecting to see another version of that bill next legislative session, because of those type of interim studies and what type of conversations starters that interim study caught. We also continue to see attacks on many of our gender diverse communities. So we continue to see those type of bills, as well as continued classroom censorships. We know that that is not going to stop. In fact, we are expecting quite a few interim studies on classroom censorship, sex education in schools as well. So we see a lot of that. In fact, we are also going to see some interim studies in the criminal legal realm, which we always do. This could look like more fines and fees legislation, trying to scale back on that and waiving some of those in the court system. It can also look like juvenile adjudication and making sure that kids aren't ending up in the juvenile justice system earlier than they need to be. So we're trying to tackle a lot of those issues, as well as I believe CAIRs may also be working on addressing translation issues in civil courts. So if you can imagine going through the court system and not understanding anything that the judge or your attorney, if you have one, says, and it can be a really difficult process. So we're expecting a range of interim studies. So people always ask me what I do outside of legislative session. A lot of that is keeping track of what our lawmakers are talking about, because a lot of good and bad bills come from interim studies, and where lawmakers are getting a lot of their expert opinions on tend to be just people that they bring into the interim studies. So keep an eye on that. And ways that you can get involved with ACLU of Oklahoma is just go to our website. There are many ways, including volunteer opportunities, that you can sign up and march with us in many parades. We are always looking for volunteers for table booth shifts, as well as fighting against the death penalty as well, which we know is very rampant in our state. So just go to our website. You can click on the Take Action link, and really get involved in our state, because I always say that policy not only happens under the dome, but it happens across our state as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I encourage our viewers to get involved with the ACLU and join, their advocacy efforts, because advocacy doesn't happen from organizations. It happens from the people. And our legislators need to hear your voices, not just the voices of Cindy or Nicole or anyone on this call, but they need to hear from their constituents. Cindy, thank you so much. We're so happy to have you. And please feel free to hang out and chime in on other discussions. I think next we're going to head over to both Andy and Tasneem, two of our grassroots, really grassroots, like they're in the weeds. That's how grassroots they are. Organizers in Oklahoma, really trying to get people involved on that ground level. And I see them all over the place every day. So Nicole, what questions do you have for Andy and Tasneem that they can enlighten us on?
Absolutely. I think maybe real quick, Andy, if you can tell us what you do. I'm not sure people who are really tuned into voting and civic engagement will know, but not everybody may not know all the stuff you've been up to. So if you could just share a little bit real quick for us.
Sure. Yeah, this is the conversation I have at every dinner party, right? So Let's Fix This as a nonprofit. We do civic engagement, which means that's shorthand for saying that we promote participation in democracy, right? We want people to be registered to vote. We want them to turn out to vote. We want them to be informed voters. And so we try to help educate voters about specific issues, including many of the issues that we've discussed here today. But we do that by kind of deferring people or directing people to the most appropriate organization that handles that. Part of that work involves us convening a civic engagement table of about a dozen kind of like-minded and value-aligned organizations who frequently work together to promote policies that lift up Oklahomans, that provide fair and equitable representation for Oklahomans, and that generally ensure the rule of law and an active and vibrant democracy across our state.
Wonderful. And so a lot of people might just think of voting, it pops up, when there's a president, you fill out the form. What do you think about with this session? There were bills filed about different ways to vote. What do you think people should know about access to voting? And do you think there's more our legislators can be doing to help people vote as well?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Nicole. So, I think we all want a voting system that really is three things. It needs to be secure, it needs to be accessible, and it needs to be inclusive, right? So a secure voting system is something we have, and it's something you can trust on to believe that there is no fraud, that the votes are being cast and counted in accordance with the law. And Oklahoma really has the gold standard for that already. We're ahead of a lot of states. We use paper ballots that are electronically tabulated, right? It's like a Scantron test, which means we get reasonably fast results and a reliable paper trail. So that's really good. That's a big feather in our cap as a state. That means that people might see things on cable news about voter fraud or like how they do it in other states, and that is not the case. Additionally, Oklahoma uses the exact same system in every single county and precinct across the state, which is also somewhat unique. There's a lot of states that use different kinds of voting machines, even within the same state. So from a security standpoint, Oklahoma is doing excellent. From accessibility, I think of this as like generally like ease of use, like that people can vote how and when they want to. So our system is pretty decent, but could certainly be improved. And there were some bills about this issue this session. In Oklahoma, voters can vote really three ways. Early by mail, you can vote early in person or on election day. And that's when most people vote, is on election day. But there's been an increasing desire for other options, right? To be able to vote early or be able to vote by mail. In some states, early voting, early in-person voting can be done, 1 week, 2 weeks, even a month out from the actual election day, which means that as a voter, you have a lot more opportunity to like work it into your busy schedule, right? Like a lot of these voting systems were designed decades or centuries ago when life was a different pace. And so, often it can be difficult for people to find time on election day to go. Or if you have a flat tire or a sick kid, or there's other things that might pop up unexpectedly. So if you wait to the last minute, you might not have the chance to vote. And there's ways to design a system that's better. A couple of years ago, Oklahoma actually expanded early voting by 1 day for general elections. And so now we get essentially 3 days of early voting, which I'm not complaining, that's better than it was. But I would love to see, a full week or even a couple of weeks so that people have the opportunity to go vote in person if they'd like to. Additionally, Oklahoma has a decent vote by mail program, right? And we have a no excuse absentee system, which means anybody can vote by mail if they want to, but you have to sign up for it. You have to request it every year, sign up in January and say, yep, I want to vote by mail this year. And you get it by request. And what we've seen since the pandemic especially is that a number of states, I think now there's 5 states that do what's called universal absentee voting, where everybody gets mailed a ballot. Every voter who's registered gets mailed a ballot. And that is a tremendous reminder. If you're a voter, you might forget about an upcoming election, especially those elections that are like just local or county or school board that don't have all the publicity of like a presidential election. And so, as you might expect, in those states, we see turnout, like participation, way higher than Oklahoma. Right now, Oklahoma is the last or the worst at voter turnout or participation. We have only about 50% participation in most big general elections. And for other elections like primaries or local races, it is way, way, way lower. It's not uncommon in a city like Oklahoma City for turnout for like the mayor's race to be around 10 or 15%, which is pretty abysmal. With universal voting or universal mail voting, right, we see turnout that's like 75, 80%, which is incredible. And I think that in turn means we get better candidates because they know that it's not just a small slice of voters who are casting their vote. They know they have to appeal to a broader audience. And so we see like a more reasonable, thoughtful, and I guess the word moderate, right? Maybe compromise policies that result from that. So states that use universal mail voting, like Colorado was the first. They've been doing it for years. Oregon. I think Washington is looking at it. Maybe Idaho. I have to go back and look, but it's starting to really grow, and we've seen increased use of mail voting across the country, including here. There were some bills this year about trying to eliminate or change the notarization requirement for mail ballots, which can be a hurdle for a lot of people.
Right.
It is couched as a like a security measure, but I think it's probably unnecessary. There are states who do it in lots of other ways without a notarization. We're somewhat unique. I think we may be the only state that still has a notary requirement.
Wow.
And I just learned the other day that in Oklahoma, there are something like 80,000 notaries. So it shouldn't be hard to find a notary. There are literally thousands around you. I'm a notary, right? Like there's lots of people that are notaries that can notarize a ballot for free. So if you were watching this and you think voting by mail from home sounds more convenient, it probably is. And that's definitely a thing you can do. And then the third thing, so I said, secure, accessible, and then inclusive, right? And that's basically like, are all voters able to vote for the candidate of their choice and like truly express their preference? Now in Oklahoma, broadly speaking, we're not doing great about this. I think we are probably all familiar with a lack of, good options at the ballot box. And that's because, in many elected offices in Oklahoma, they're decided in the primary election, not even the general election. And because Oklahoma has what's called a partially closed primary, it means that many voters are prevented from casting a ballot to decide the outcome of a race. So, in general terms, Republicans vote in Republican primaries, Democrats vote in Democratic primaries, Libertarians vote in Libertarian primaries, and then independent voters are kind of floating around. And right now, the Democratic Party lets independents vote in Democratic primaries, but the other parties do not. And so when we see there's a lot of races, including state legislative races, where the only candidates are Republican candidates or only Democratic candidates. And that means that everybody else in that district doesn't get a say. And it means that there's not a general election. Like those races are decided by an even smaller sliver of the population. And so in cases like this, we have districts who have people elected by only like 5% of the voters in that town or in that district. And that is certainly not the representative democracy, I think, that most of us think that we live in. And so there are bills that were filed this year to change that, to open primaries or to move a race from being a closed primary, if it's only one party, to just put that on the general ballot so that everybody can vote. There are certainly ways that we can restructure how we run elections that would maintain the security, maintain the accessibility, and improve kind of the inclusive nature of those races. One big example of this, I think, is for Attorney General last year. Gittner Drummond, of course, was the victor of that. But when he was in the primary, he ran against then incumbent John O'Connor. There was no Democratic candidates in the race or independent candidates. In the Libertarian, there was one Libertarian candidate, so they're on the general. So you had this highly contentious, very narrowly decided election in the Republican primary that almost half of the voters in the state didn't get a chance to vote in. And they did get the vote in the general, but had there not been a Libertarian candidate, that race for a statewide elective office would have been decided by a tiny sliver of voters in our state. And that's really sad. And related to that, there's a lot of races that are decided because no one ever files, like no challenger files. The state insurance commissioner was elected by default. He was the only person who filed. And so when that happens, like that's certainly, again, if no one ever voted you into office, how can you say that people wanted you in that office just because someone didn't file? So to that note, like if you're watching this and considering running for office, maybe something to consider that there are often positions that go unfilled because no one goes unfilled or goes unchallenged because no one throws their hat in the ring.
Right, right. While you're talking about voting and voter access or access to voting, there were two thoughts that came to mind. And Andy, you can chime in, or if Cindy, Tasneem, if you have any thoughts on this. The first question is, what's going on with the online voter registration? Does anyone know? I know that there was a bill passed years ago that approved it, but are we ever going to see that come to fruition in Oklahoma? What do you
Yeah,
think?
I'd love to touch base on this one because this is, like Andy, this is my bread and butter. So over at the Oklahoma Policy Institute, I'm also our lead organizer for our Strengthening Democracy Affinity Group. We have a couple of different buckets that we work in at OK Policy. And so anything that is all about voter access, democracy access, participatory governance is what our Strengthening Democracy Group really focuses on. And Adam, to your point of, are we ever going to see online voter registration? It is going to take enough of a racket from people to push the legislature into implementing this process. So we've already passed it, but getting it to be executed is a whole other situation. Cindy earlier talked about State Question 780 and 781. It isn't until now that we're starting to see actual dollars and appropriations go into funding State Question 781. So we're going to need to do a little bit of work on that. I know Senator Julia Kurt earlier this year had put some legislation together to try and push us on online voter registration. But to that point, Adam, we've also got to focus on what are other ways that we can make voting more accessible to the people.
Right.
The Muslim American community is predominantly an immigrant community. We speak more than one language. And there have been conversations about how do we get ballots in other languages as well.
Right.
There have been some conversations with Representative Arturo Alonso, come to find out that it's actually a state Supreme Court case that gets in the way of us to be able to push for those ballots.
Wow.
But that's something that the legislature can take action on to make sure that we get done. On top of which, there has been some good things that have come out of the legislature this year when it comes to basically making democracy easier. We had Senate Bill 290 that was authored by Senator Warren Hamilton. It would raise the pay for poll workers. So for election inspectors, it'd go from 110 to 225. For clerks, it'd be $100 to $200. And then we also have a couple of bills that have made it out of their original chamber to their committees, to the committee in the opposite chamber, and that has the potential of being brought out again for this following session. House Bill 1768 would allow utility bills in lieu of driver's licenses for voter registration. This is something that would be incredible for those who are in rural Oklahoma, folks who have just moved and their driver's licenses are somewhere else or in another part of the country. But we still have a lot of work that we need to do. One of these bills that we want to continue to see going forward at OK Policy is House Bill 1629. Regina Goodwin, she is a fantastic advocate for voter rights and registration. Many justice-involved individuals, formerly incarcerated individuals, they don't know if they have the right to vote. They're completely unsure of whether they have that access, but they do. And so this bill would have clarified that immediately leaving incarceration, you would have the ability to know whether you can register to vote or get you to be registered. As we know, Oklahoma is one of the criminal justice capitals in the country for that. So,
one other thought, and that's some good information about the online voting challenges, and that people need to reach out to their senators and their representatives and voice their concerns about that, because in the world we live in, where everything is online, I mean, you can literally purchase a car online and have it delivered to your house, right? I mean, you do everything using the internet. Why can you not register to vote online? That just boggles my mind. But then here's another question. and Tasneem, I really would like to hear your perspective on this. There are a number of states that enacted over the last decade or so same day voter registration. What is the logic behind not allowing same day voter registration? And is there a path? Now, I know there's going to be some roadblocks, but is there a path to making that happen in Oklahoma as well?
Absolutely. So to touch on that, Together Oklahoma and our Strengthening Democracy group also entertains conversations about feedback. We want to hear from communities, what do they want to see when it comes to democracy issues or expanding democracy. One thing that we really have to do here in Oklahoma is protect our vote, protect the ability to have access to our vote. There has been conversations around automatic voter registration. Andy had brought up earlier about universal mail-in ballots so that everybody receives a ballot no matter what. There has been conversations about ranked choice voting so that basically we are able to get the best of both worlds if necessary, or whoever your second choice ends up being, something that can bring communities together. But we've also had conversations about how do we protect the processes that we currently have. Earlier this year, we saw, and this was around when State Question 820 was approaching the ballot, we saw a bunch of bills come from the state legislature to try and roll back the ballot initiative process, which is one of our core beliefs that we have as Oklahomans in our Constitution, is that we should be able to pass things through popular vote. Oklahoma already has one of the hardest ballot initiative processes in the nation, with the exception of maybe Texas, just based on its population. But Senate Bill 518 was a bill that we stalled this year. It still can be seen in committee, but we made sure that it didn't hit the floor this year. What it would have done was it would have added a filing fee. Right now, it costs $0 to file a state question. It would have raised that to $500.
Wow.
It would have expanded the amount of time to sue against a state question in state Supreme Court. Right now, it's 10 days. It would have expanded it to 20 days. And we've seen a recent uptick in suing any of these popular ballot initiatives. And it would have added an additional data point to collect. So right now, all you need is your birth date, your signature, your address, and that's pretty much it. But this would come up with another point. We've seen the ballot initiative counting process and verification process get extremely messy. It was the Secretary of State ended up subcontracting this out to an outside vendor in the 2022 elections, and so it's made it a little bit more complicated in that sort of a process. We've talked a lot at our affinity group of how do we get a lot of these things passed as a package, maybe a voter reform package, or tackling it one bit at a time. It's incredibly important that people realize that this is one of the ways that they can exercise their power. If it wasn't for the ballot initiative process, we would have never received Medicaid expansion. Wouldn't see the decarceration and for rehabilitation instead with State Question 781. It is imperative that Oklahomans realize that their voting rights need to be protected.
Absolutely. Andy, welcome back. We lost you for a second. So glad you were able to hop back in, because, before we get, close to the end of our live session today, I know there are opportunities outside of the legislative session and interim studies for people to get involved. And one of the things coming up here in just a couple of weeks is CivicsCon. And so can you tell the audience about CivicsCon, what that's all about, and why they should be there, why they should get involved?
Yeah, sorry, Adam. Our power went out and I'm in a basement office. Very dark here for a few minutes, and so our internet is still coming back on, a little choppy. Could you repeat your question one more time?
Yes. So we wanted to hear more about what's coming up with CivicsCon, as an event, and why should people care about that, how they can learn more about it and get involved with it.
Yeah, great. We have an event coming up. As you said, it's a civics convention, Civics Con. And it's like Comic Con, but for a different topic, a different kind of nerd, I guess. And it'll be at Rose State College on June 26th and 27th. And we should have the schedule coming out this afternoon or of the weekend. Once I put a few finishing touches on it. And it's going to be a really great couple of days for people, students, adults, anyone who is interested in learning a bit more about how Oklahoma's government functions from the city level on up to the state level, maybe even some federal conversations, and how sessions about specific issues, things like separation of church and state, education policy. Ellen's going to be one of our presenters. Adam, you're going to be there. I think Veronica and Nicole are going to be there talking about advocacy and marginalized communities. We're going to have a lot of really good presentations about the work, right? About how we build a better state, how we get organized in our communities. Everything from how do you talk to your neighbors, your uncles, like your friends, about these issues in a way that is helpful and constructive and builds strength, right? And I think builds power for voters is very important. So we would love to have people come. You can go to civicscon.com to get your tickets. Tickets are just $10, super cheap. And it should be a really great couple of days. I'm really excited about it.
Yeah, $10 is a steal for all the amazing speakers and the education people will get. I mean, it's cheaper than a meal at McDonald's these days. So, go to CivicsCon and not only learn from the presenters, but get some motivation and some encouragement for how you can get involved. All right, Nicole, what questions do we have? Cindy, Andy, and Tasneem are all still with us. So maybe there's a last question or two we can throw out at them as a panel before we wrap up our live stream. And we just want to thank the three of you, as well as Ellen, who had to hop off, for joining us today, for giving us your time and your expertise. And we appreciate all that you are doing, because we know the work of engaging with the legislator and the legislative landscape in Oklahoma is a challenging one. So thank you, and we appreciate all that you do. Nicole?
Absolutely. Thank you again all so much. I know it's a Friday afternoon and the session is technically over, so you're hoping to escape. I think we all of us here kind of work with diverse communities, different backgrounds, different ages, education levels, the whole thing. A lot of people on this call I know volunteer with different groups as well. Can you think, probably just one by one, what was the biggest common denominator across communities, either good or bad, that was kind of a topic for the legislative session? Something that either people could rally around that was a good thing, bad thing, something that we saw kind of affecting everyone.
So the question, what's something everybody rallied around this year?
Or should have
rallied around. Well, Ellen's not here, but education was definitely the big thing this year, especially with the fights around vouchers. I know we over at OK Policy had sent out special announcements to try and get folks on this, as we know that vouchers are not necessarily great for public schools across the board. Housing was also a very big issue that we saw this year as well. One of the bills that we worked on at OK Policy was with Representative Daniel Pay on anti-retaliation. We know the housing crisis is huge across the United States right now, and it's, you can literally go into any of your major metros or rural areas, and you see folks are in desperate need of a home. The Housing Authority actually just dropped a plan recently that puts $215 million into funding new homes for single family units at 0% loans. It could go farther, it's only at 120% of the poverty line. So And then lastly to that, and to Cindy, and I'll turn it to you over after this. But again, we've seen a lot of attacks on gender diversity, on healthcare and what can be administrated around healthcare, which opens the gates into what healthcare can look like for a lot of other minority communities across the state of Oklahoma.
Yeah, I would love to echo what Taz said in that everything ties together, especially when it comes to healthcare as well as criminal legal reform. We know that when we invest in mental health care, housing rights, domestic violence response, that there are going to be less people incarcerated, and we are going to be able to spend that money elsewhere in our state where it is really needed. As well as when it comes to healthcare, we know when we attack the most marginalized members of our community that they are not going to stop there. That we saw when it came to bodily autonomy, they are not going to stop at what happened to the doctor's office, but they are also going to go after contraceptive access as well. So we want to make sure that people know not only does it impact other people, that politicians are also going to come after you as well, and making sure that we stand for all of us.
Thank you so much. Nicole, do you have any other questions for our guests?
I think that covered it for me. I know I was lucky to work with both of them this session, and it's true what they say. It's not just going to stop at one group that they're targeting. With the library censorship bills, the same language they're going to use there, they can use for our Muslim community, for communities all across the state. So it's important for people to stay involved, and there's a lot of different groups to work with. There's a lot of avenues to find out this information and find out ways to connect with your legislator or become one yourself.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, as we close out, do we have any last words of advice or encouragement that you can give to our audience? Tasneem?
Yeah, absolutely. If you want to make sure that your voice is heard, not just by legislators, but also by advocacy groups and nonprofit professionals, I want to invite all of you to Oklahoma Policy's summer listening sessions. We'll be sending invitations out to businesses, nonprofits, and organizations, as well as individuals, because we want to hear about what your priorities as a community are. Just like that ballot access stuff I mentioned earlier, Adam, we really want to make sure that we are doing the community justice by listening to what you want to focus on. We synthesize all this information for our reports and our data, so you'll have direct access in doing that. There are people across the state, especially the folks here at CAIR Oklahoma, who are fighting for you, who are making sure that your rights are not just being adequately defended, but defended and are thriving. So thank you to all of y'all at CAIR for giving me the opportunity to speak here. And again, I look forward to seeing you guys all again soon.
Thank you so much, Tasneem. Cindy?
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to that over at the ACLU. So we have some upcoming events. One of the most recent ones is going to be Juneteenth. So if you want to volunteer, come out, dance, listen to music, eat all the very good food, just go to our website, acluok.org. We are also going to be talking about some other things as well. I think it is our legislative wrap-up that is going to happen Tuesday, June 13th. So if you just want to find out any more information, just go to our website.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We really appreciate the time you took to listen to not only what our guests had to say, but also to learn from their expertise. And I will leave you with some words of advice that we're not just fighting to protect our democracy and our country for the rights of all Americans, regardless of cultural, racial, ethnic, or religious backgrounds, but we're also fighting every day to build a better future for our children and our grandchildren and future generations who will, we hope, inherit something good from what we have invested our time in. So stay positive, keep your head up and keep hope alive, because although at times things may seem difficult or impossible, they actually are not. And we are moving in the right direction, and we have to keep chipping away at the iceberg, if you will. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you, Veronica, for managing the comments and for making sure everything ran smoothly in the background. Thank you, Nicole, for bringing our guests together. Adam Soltani and the CAIR Oklahoma team signing off. Hope you have a wonderful weekend.